The world's climate agreement built on low-confidence assumptions. I'm Brian Lilley with TheRebel.Media. You've seen the headlines declaring landmark deal on climate. The victory for the planet. It was cheered on by the world's media as if Will Smith had just beaten back aliens to save the world from annihilation in Independence Day. Hardly the case, though. Is this deal going to work? Probably not. First off, despite the push by green activists, it remains a voluntary agreement. It isn't binding. Of course, it was never going to be binding because, well, it can't be. It can't be binding because there's simply no organization that has control over every country, every government on the planet. And if there was, well, those countries would cease to be sovereign, wouldn't they? So the agreement's voluntary, and countries will set their own targets, and they'll spend lots of money on fighting a rise in temperature. I'm not going to go through the whole agreement. Instead, I want to look at the science behind it because we're told we've got to listen to the science. What was agreed on in Paris, well, that was a political agreement, supposedly backed up by science. Is it? Let's take a look at some facts here. Let's remember why we're doing all this. Why the countries of the world are saying we must act. Well, to stop temperature from rising more than 2 degrees Celsius over the coming decades. Are scientists even sure this is happening? We're told yes. We're told that there's a consensus when in fact none exists. You don't have to take my word for it. I'm not going to argue with the United Nations. In fact, let's look at the United Nations' own scientific summary of the problem and see what they say. So I'm going to only quote to you from United Nations documents on climate change. It's important to note that when they make a claim, they tell you how confident they are in the claim. Thus, this statement from their 2014 assessment report, the scientific report that is the basis for this new political agreement in Paris. Quote, each of the last 3 decades has been successively warmer at the Earth's surface than any preceding decade from 1850. The period from 1983 to 2012 was likely the warmest 30-year period in the last 1,400 years in the Northern Hemisphere where such assessment is possible. And then in brackets it says medium confidence. Medium confidence. Doesn't sound certain, does it? It's not certain at all. They have a medium confidence that the Earth has experienced the warmest 3 decades. Now, maybe they've got medium confidence because, let's just use 1850, records going back to then are spotty at best. Maybe they have medium confidence because the measurements and the measuring tools they used decades ago or more than a century ago may not have been as accurate as what we use now. And that point becomes even more important when you look at how small the claimed increase in temperature over the last 165 years really is. Here's another quote. In addition to robust multi-decadal warming, the globally averaged surface temperature exhibits substantial decade and interannual variability. Due to this natural variability, trends based on very short records are very sensitive to the beginning and end dates and do not in general reflect long-term climate trends. As one example, the rate of warming over the past 15 years, 1998 to 2012, 0.05. In fact, the range is actually negative 0.05 to 0.15 Celsius per decade, which begins with a strong El Nino is smaller than the rate calculated since 1951, 0.08 to 0.14 Celsius per decade. Think about that for a moment. We're talking about warming of negative 0.05 to 0.15 degrees per decade between 98 and 2012. That means we might have actually cooled in that time period because they say negative 0.05 to 0.15. The spread between the low and the high end of that range is bigger than any potential warming. Now, of course, this isn't going the way they want to, so they have to warn us. Don't use short spans of 15 years because between 51 and 2012, well, the warming ranges between 0.08 and 0.14 degrees per decade. Not even a quarter of a degree. And again, the range in possible warming is about half the size of the greatest fear. Yet despite this medium-level confidence in the wildly underwhelming potential warming, we're told we need to change our entire planet. Now, one thing that everyone needs to remember is that this entire scientific process is based on computer modeling. And computer models of what the future holds or is supposed to hold, they don't always turn out to be true, a fact buried in the UN's own scientific review. Another quote for you. For the period from 1998 to 2012, 111 of the 114 available climate model simulations shows a surface warming trend larger than the observations. Translations? We did computer models showing how hot things would be, but in reality, well, also known as the actual measurements on the ground, it didn't work out that way. It was not as warm as they predicted. In fact, it was colder. Reading the actual scientific documents that back up the UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and are the basis of the Paris talks is actually pretty fascinating. After getting caught in the past making wild claims like mountain ice melting without being able to back it up, the UN is a bit more careful these days. We're told, by politicians anyway, that climate change, that CO2 emissions, all of that, it's causing more floods, more drought, more hurricanes. The UN scientists actually say, not really. Let me quote again. There is low confidence in observed global scale trends in droughts due to lack of direct observations, dependencies of inferred trends on the choice of the definition for drought, and due to geographical inconsistencies in drought trends. Another one on hurricanes. We're always told we're getting more hurricanes. Not really. There is low confidence that long-term changes in the tropical cyclone activity are robust, and there is low confidence in the attribution of global changes to any particular cause. Well, what about flooding? We all know we're getting more floods, and it's all due to climate change. Again, not really. There is low confidence that anthropogenic climate change has affected the frequency and magnitude of fluvial floods on a global scale. The whole document has enough caveats and cautions to make it essentially meaningless. It's built on Swiss cheese. It's an agreement, a document built on low confidence assumption. Low confidence things are likely warming that may be occurring in over a wide temperature range. All meaningless. And for this, we're going to try and change our entire planet. Canada is going to revamp its entire economy. The world will change how it works. It's all a bad idea. We were sold a bill of goods going into this conference, and now that they've got their deal, we'll watch for what they will promise next, what other snake oil they're going to try and sell us as the cure for what doesn't ail us.